law. Other key convergences I think that we can be talking about are challenges to ASEAN's unity. ASEAN is an important actor within the region. ASEAN's centrality is important in terms of how the region's integrating moving forward, but it's also susceptible to outside influence, where some of its partners are influenced either through economics or corruption, which creates challenges in terms of ASEAN having a common purpose in moving forward. Resilience in terms of supply chains is also an important theme that I think it's really come to light over the past few years, especially under the COVID-19 pandemic, in which supply chains were disrupted by COVID-19, disrupted by policy choices. And this has affected all our economies. And growing, you'll see resilience and resilient supply chains being major themes, not only in the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, but many Indo-Pacific strategies. Infrastructure connectivity is also an important aspect of thinking about the region. And the region needs more infrastructure and connectivity. The more integrated the region is, by having more bridges and roads and ports that connect the economies of the region, this will ensure that the region is more economically dynamic, strategically autonomous, and makes decisions on issues that are important for the region. So there are many, many, many convergences in terms of thinking about security issues. Can we go to the next slide, please? While security is critical to thinking about the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, so are non-traditional security issues. And I've listed some here, but climate change, piracy, illegal fishing, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates that transnational diseases are another example of a non-traditional security challenge that can be highly disruptive to the region's economies and societies. And it's critical that Canada engages in the region thinking about how it can cooperate in the areas of non-traditional security. Importantly, and as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, black swans are another area that we need to prepare for. Black swans such as natural disasters, or the COVID-19 pandemic means that we need to find opportunities and bridges to cooperate within the region, build institutional ties, and find ways to help our partners within the Indo-Pacific develop strategies to deal with unpredictable and challenging crises that do occur. Climate change is somewhat predictable, but transnational diseases or natural disasters aren't. And this will require more cooperation in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation. It will require more cooperation in terms of search and rescue, and it will require more cooperation in terms of how we think about engagement within the region. Next slide. And the next slide. So as Canada is engaging in this Indo-Pacific region, it's put forth 5 key pillars. And these 5 key pillars, I think, are comprehensive in looking at the region. They say it in different terms, but they're really focusing on economics, traditional security issues, and non-traditional security issues. And they use the key words of promoting peace, resilience, and security within the region. They also talk about expanding trade, investment, and supply chain resilience. Importantly, connecting people. All right? People really are the key to solving problems. And when you don't have strong relationships, you don't speak the same kinds of languages, and you don't think about the region in the same way, it's difficult to solve problems. So I think that this is a really, really interesting aspect of the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategies, investing in people and connections. The environment, of course, is going to be a key part of any Indo-Pacific engagement. This region is particularly sensitive to climate change. And if you think about Vietnam and Southeast Asia in particular, as sea levels rise, your key sources of food security, such as the Mekong Delta, may be impacted negatively. So climate change is an important contribution and public good provision that's key to thinking about how Canada is engaging in the region. And lastly, again, thinking about how Canada can engage in the region through proactive diplomacy. Let's go to the next slide, please. And the next slide. So as we're thinking about Canada's engagement within the region, we have to think about where are the key partners that Canada is thinking about to have a sustained and meaningful relationship. Of course, working with ASEAN is critical. ASEAN centrality and recognizing ASEAN centrality really is a key part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, and that we are thinking about how the region is tethered together through the ASEAN way, where ASEAN countries or Indo-Pacific countries agree upon a common future, agree upon a common process of moving forward. Our ambassador mentioned this morning the Asian Regional Forum is another area where Canada is thinking about engaging more proactively within the region. Through the ARF, Canada is listening to the issues that are on the table within the region, but also providing suggestions of how to move forward. Again, being part of the dialogue is really, really critical to understanding the region, understanding what's needed in the region, but also presenting interesting solutions or solutions outside the box to provide stability to the region. There's other aspects such as the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, the Pacific Islands Forum, and again, we see Canada also thinking about engaging in the Indo-Pacific with its traditional allies, the United States, the EU, but also North Pacific countries like Japan and South Korea. These are critical partners to engage in the region. Not only because they're like-minded countries and they want to invest in a rules-based region, but we have many pre-existing relationships that can be leveraged to engage in the region in a more sustained and meaningful way. And again, that's really important for Vietnamese and Southeast Asians. You want to know why Canada's coming to the region, but will we be here in 4 years or 5 years or 10 years? And again, the best way to do that is to do that through building strong partnerships. Next slide. Now, as we think about Canada, and because we're sitting in Hanoi today, I wanted to touch upon ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Studies, and how Canada is thinking about that engagement. ASEAN is a critical partner in terms of how Canada thinks about the region. Its GDP is significant, $4.1 trillion. Its population is significant, more than 660 million people. And we have a pre-established relationship of more than 45 years. This long-standing relationship is a critical part of how we are engaging in the region and trying to bring a meaningful contribution. Next slide, please. And to do that, affirming ASEAN centrality will continue to be critical. I mentioned this many times, and ASEAN has had a special role in, of course, linking Northeast Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries through the so-called ASEAN Way. But more and more, it's seen as a critical organization that will be important for engaging in the region. If Canada wants to get stakeholder buy-in for its Indo-Pacific strategy, it's going to be critical to recognize the decision-making process and preferences of the region. And the region is very heterogeneous. And the heterogeneity requires Canada to think about the region through regional structures and regional decision-making organizations like ASEAN. Now, there's a lot of different areas that Canada's thinking about. I'm just going to touch upon a couple of them that I think are important. One is seeking a participation in the Asian Defense Ministers meeting so they can contribute to building some peace and stability within the region and solving some of the difficult challenges that lie, particularly in the South China Sea. Talking about the ASEAN plan, Canada plan for a trust fund, again trying to strengthen Canada's engagement through funding for programs that build a deeper relationship. The Canadian Trade Gateway, again, as an entry point for Canadian businesses to come to this region, deepen economic partnerships, and potentially build new markets for Canada, but also for ASEAN countries to trade with Canada. And again, this morning, the ambassador talked about a potential ASEAN-Canada FTA moving forward. These are the kinds of agreements that link the region to Canada and link Canada to the region. Next slide. Now, there's a lot of different initiatives that Canada's put forward in terms of its Indo-Pacific strategy. It wants to contribute to the region's security. And as I mentioned in the security challenges that there are many convergences between Canada and this region, that Canada feels it needs to provide a bigger footprint to the region through a bigger presence and defense coordination. Now, as we look at this, you can see that Canada has engaged in the broader Indo-Pacific region through several different initiatives. One is called Operation Neon. And Operation Neon started in 2017 after North Korea detonated a nuclear weapon. It was seen as an important contribution to enforcing sanctions on North Korea. And this action is not only unilateral, but also in a multilateral form where Canada is working with other countries to, again, enforce sanctions in the region. This kind of multilateral cooperation is very important in terms of providing security to the region. And moving forward, Canada is going to be thinking about how it can bolster a rules-based order in the South China Sea, promote peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, and again, to continue to try and enforce sanctions on states that are engaged in weapons proliferation. We see Canada really engaged in enhancing its defense cooperation with ASEAN. And I think moving forward, you're going to see more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation, helping the region build maritime domain awareness activities, and thinking about creative ways to, again, build stability in the region. Next slide, please. In terms of trade, and trade is, Canada is a trading country. Gateway Canada is meant to, Gateway in Southeast Asia, again, is meant to link Canadian businesses to the region. By linking businesses to the region, you create people-to-people relations, and those connections are important in terms of developing a common understanding of interests and needs for the region. We're pledged to have more large-scale trade missions to the region, and those trade missions are meant to start to open markets, build a common understanding of trade, and ensure that it's the marketplace and rules that dictate the competition of the market. And that's going to be increasingly important as we think about trade and stability in the region. We want to ensure that it's the market forces that are dictating how we engage in trade and how we get access to markets, and not politics. Other important aspects is supporting small and medium-sized enterprises to come to the region, to find out more about the region, and to open up the region to trade. And that means coordinating with chambers of commerce, but also having important events where you bring Southeast Asian countries and other countries to the region. So next week in Singapore, there's going to be quite a large-scale event on Canada in Asia, where universities and businesses, as well as diplomats, come together to talk about their stakes within the region. Next slide, please. Security, I've mentioned security a few times. Security continues to remain a central concern for Canada. When we think about the region, we think about the $5.5 trillion of trade that goes through the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and how a disruption in sea lines of communication could have a fundamentally negative consequence for the region, but also for the global economy. How can we bring stability? And stability doesn't come from just military footprint. It comes from engaging with local partners, supporting international law. It comes from training local partners on international law and how to engage in international negotiations. And I think if you've taken a look at some of the 1.5 track dialogue that does happen between and within this region, Canada has been an important contributor to helping train lawyers and train Southeast Asians to have a better understanding of international law so they can negotiate and use international law to secure their position in Southeast Asia. Next slide. I mentioned non-traditional security, and I continue to think that this is such a critical area of cooperation for the region because it does face so many different issues. We can take a look at areas of concern including climate change, human trafficking, human security. We can think about food security issues. And today we may have full bellies, but again, if if the Mekong Delta does become more salinated, more salty, what does that mean for Southeast Asia's food basket? What does it mean for the region's stability and managing the region's governance? This will continue to be a challenge as we think about non-traditional security issues moving forward. Next slide, please. So in order to do that, in order to try and deal with some of the challenges of non-security issues, again, Canada's thinking about how it can strengthen its cooperation with other middle powers to provide some public goods. Our particular strategy doesn't talk about the Quad, although I think that should be a place that we engage in to provide public goods through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And that could be working on infrastructure and connectivity. It could be helping the region integrate more deeply so it can secure its own strategic autonomy. Promoting or cultivating human capital is another area. And that links back to the connection between people that I talked about earlier. So bringing Vietnamese and Southeast Asians to study in Canada, to get trained, to bring those skills back to the region so that the region can develop. This will all contribute to dealing with some of the non-traditional security challenges within the region, but also developmental challenges. Next slide. Lastly, and I think importantly, is diplomacy. What are the forms of innovative diplomacy that Canada is engaging in already, but trying to enhance through the Indo-Pacific strategy? And here I think there's many interesting aspects, and one of them are new minilateral formulas. And I'm not sure how many of you have read through the Indo-Pacific strategy, but one of the most innovative aspects is how it's engaging with Taiwan. By maintaining its one China policy, Canada's decided to work with Taiwan on issues in terms of Aboriginal reconciliation, and also working with New Zealand and Australia. So that's a really innovative way to build partnerships within the region. And I think that Canada's going to continue to do that. Working with the United States will also be critical. Canada is ultimately situated in North America. Its closest partner is the United States. And as we engage in the Indo-Pacific, it's quite natural that we continue to work with our closest partner. And the Canadian-United States Strategic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific is a good example of that. We also see investing in resources. And investing in resources means getting a better understanding of the region's needs, what it wants from Canada, and the direction of the region. And this means enhancing our resources in terms of understanding Southeast Asia, understanding China, and understanding other aspects of the region so we can engage in the region more thoughtfully. And lastly, but not least, what's very innovative or interesting or perhaps part of the Canadian brand in the Indo-Pacific strategy is this feminist foreign policy approach. Canada firmly believes in the importance of diversity, the importance of mobilizing all its human capital. That means men and women, people of all different backgrounds. And Canada, in its Indo-Pacific strategy, is committed to try and ensure that the region is unlocking its potential by supporting inclusive development. That means supporting women, that means supporting minorities, it means ensuring that all members of the Indo-Pacific are contributing to the region. And you might be saying, why is this important? And I think that when we look at our societies and we're thinking about the engagement and building stability, it means that we need to have more representation of all parts of our society. In that sense, supporting inclusive development through a feminist foreign policy is part of the Canadian Indo-Pacific brand that is meant to, again, unlock the potential in this region in terms of all members of the society. Next. If you're interested in more about this, there's a lot of different references. I will ask the organizers to distribute this PowerPoint if you'd like. Again, these are my private thoughts. I don't represent the government, and I probably have a few different views, but I'm really open to any questions that you might have based on today's discussion, or anything that you would like to ask in terms of how Canada's engaged in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Nagy. You brought out a very comprehensive pictures of why Indo-Pacific matter to Canada, from sharing interests as well as concern with the regions and Vietnam. And also from that, we draw a very insightful aspect of the Canadian approach to Indo-Pacific on its strategies. Particularly on his lectures, we can see a wide range of initiatives from trade, security, particularly at the end, the innovative diplomacy initiative to implement the strategy. So the Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is not just a slogan. As there's some concrete resources, some concrete initiative on that. Thank you for that. And Dr. Stephen Nagy just bring out a scholar approach on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. And now I would like to invite the top Canada diplomat here in Vietnam to bring forward some other thought of the Canada's Indo-Pacific strategies. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you. Xin cảm ơn. Chào các nhà ngoại giao trẻ của Việt Nam. And thank you, Dr. Lan Ang, for this great welcome. I want to thank Dr. Nagy for his excellent presentation. And I really like the lens that he's put on the strategy in terms of security and non-traditional security threats, as well as where he's underlined some of the innovation that's in the policy. I hope that his being here today from Tokyo also demonstrates the way that Canada makes foreign policy. The Indo-Pacific strategy is the result, as a document and as the funding that comes behind it, is the result of a long period of negotiations. Most of that invisible to the public. But Canada has made an effort and continues to make an effort, even foreign policy, to consult broadly. Our foreign minister established a panel of experts from business, academia, and civil society to advise her directly on the shape of the Indo-Pacific strategy. As a matter of course, members of our foreign ministry conducted over a year of consultations with the public, from subnational governments, businesses, First Nations and Indigenous peoples, to gather information from them about what was important in the strategy for them. And out we come with the strategy. Once the strategy is launched, we expect the feedback to continue. Canada's approach to the Indo-Pacific is ambitious, comprehensive, and long-term. This is a 5-year strategy with a 10-year view. And we will be going back after 5 years to ask for more money and to make adjustments to that strategy. So having experts such as Dr. Nagy look at it from an external point of view, highlight areas where we might have weaknesses, where he believes we have strengths from his position, are really important. And our discussions today in launching the Indo-Pacific strategy in Vietnam are also part of that process. Because you, your government, and the people of Vietnam are also stakeholders in Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Our intent is to support sustainable development, peace, and security in the region. And as Dr. Nagy has pointed out, that requires contributions from all segments of society. It cannot be just governments alone that negotiate and implement the strategy. So I'm delighted that he's here today to start that conversation with you. And we continue to invite more conversations as we move forward to implement some elements of the strategy. Perhaps I can just highlight a few areas where we see Vietnam in the strategy. One, on peace and security. We've boosted our defense collaboration with Vietnam, and we'll continue to do that. We have a Deputy Minister dialogue on defense policy. We continue to provide training in UN peacekeeping operations and US staff officer training, not only for Vietnam, but for the wider ASEAN region. And we continue to support the Women, Peace, and Security agenda here in Vietnam. And I'm delighted that the Prime Minister has recently committed Vietnam to making a national action plan for women, peace, and security, something that Canada has done and is renewing right now. On economics, as Dr. Nagy said, the economic weight of the world is shifting to this region. It's a huge importance for Canada. We need to ensure that that trade is based on transparent rules where everyone understands and competes on an equal footing. Canada and Vietnam are partners of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which creates high standards for not only exports and imports, but in the way that we do trade, with respect to labor rights and environment as well. On people-to-people exchanges, I think is one of the more innovative aspects of the strategy, as Dr. Nagy pointed out. And this means we're taking a long-term view in investing in people in the region and investing in exchanges between scholars, non-governmental organizations, academic institutes, and businesses to ensure that we have resilience in our relationships and depth in our relationships with the Indo-Pacific. In addition, we've emphasized sustainable development, building a green future. And Vietnam is a big piece of the puzzle of a sustainable future for the Indo-Pacific region. Vietnam is one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. Canada has a long history of supporting Vietnam's development and sustainable development, and will continue to support Vietnam's efforts for a clean energy transition. How do we move from our reliance on coal to more sustainable versions of energy? Vietnam needs technology and investment from overseas to meet its ambitious goals, and Canada is stepping up as an important partner for Vietnam in that effort. And finally, our diplomatic footprint. How does Canada remain an engaged and strategic partner for the region? That's by increasing our diplomatic footprint. This year we mark 50 years of diplomatic relations with Vietnam. Next year, Canada will move from its very prestigious but slightly old embassy in Ba Ding Square to a modern high-rise tower that is environmentally sustainable and accessible to everyone. And that's exciting for us because it allows us to represent Canada from a position of innovation and strength and openness to all segments of Vietnamese society. And finally, we are engaging more and more with ASEAN and with multilateral institutions in the region to ensure that Canada is playing an important role to support peace and security and economic development. So I want to thank Dr. Nagy once again for that great presentation and that demonstration of the openness that Canada has in our Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, to just give us the endorsement from the Canadian government of the long-term commitment for peace, security, especially for sustainable development of Vietnam and the regions. And perhaps talking about the regions, we also have here the Charter Fair of Canada in ASEAN. The floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I won't take too long because, of course, we want to hear from you and want to hear your thoughts. This really is an important opportunity for us to understand how our Indo-Pacific strategy resonates with different stakeholders. But as Dr. Stephen and Ambassador Style have mentioned, ASEAN is a central piece to our Indo-Pacific strategy. We see the importance of ASEAN to the region in terms of ensuring the stability of the region and the prosperity of the region as well. And Canada has been engaging with ASEAN, and we want to do more. And so the Indo-Pacific strategy is an opportunity to facilitate this deepened partnership. It tracks along the same lines as the IPS itself in terms of us looking at this as a long-term commitment. How do we do this in a meaningful way? How do we ensure that our engagement with ASEAN as we shift from a dialogue partner to a strategic partner is strategic? What does that mean? How do we engage in a different way? How do we engage in a way for mutual benefits for both ASEAN and Canada? It's important for us to then look at what is ASEAN doing, what does ASEAN want to do? And one of the key guiding documents is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So touching on areas of maritime cooperation, on connectivity, on the Sustainable Development Goals, and on economic and other areas of cooperation. So we see these things coming together and should be our guiding elements as we move forward in our partnership and support all areas of ASEAN's engagement under the socio-cultural pillar, under its economic pillar, and under its political security pillar as well. And I think I said I wasn't going to talk for too long, so just to give a sense of some of the, what does this look like? I think part of this conversation is to talk about what is our vision, but what does this actually mean? What does this mean concretely? And it's important when we put this on the table as a 10-year vision with 5 years in resources, what's going to be different? What are we going to do in this space and in this time as well? Some of the things, so you'll see in the overall Indo-Pacific strategy resonate very much with ASEAN. Our focus in areas of defense engagement. And in that, I pull out the piece around women, peace, and security. I think this is a very interesting area because it has links to the defense and security, but also to the socio-cultural pillar as well in terms of gender equality. It also ties in with the economic areas as well in terms of women's economic empowerment being an essential piece to gender equality and being able to contribute to the stability and the prosperity of the region. On the economic front, we are well into our negotiations of an ASEAN-Canada free trade agreement. Again, recognizing the opportunities that exist between Canada and ASEAN in terms of that the economic relationship and the trade opportunities. We're seeing that growth already. We see the potential with an FTA. Other areas, education. Education is a great area to improve and to facilitate ties between people and invest in human capital. And so we want to be able to do more building on successes of existing education programs we have. So I'll stop there, but just to give you a sense of how ASEAN is a big piece of this, and these are some of the ways that we see our partnership continuing to grow today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Simin. And if you read the Indo-Pacific Strategy of Canada, you'll find a very useful word, SEED. It is the scholarship program of Canada for country in the region. It may be for you. So now I would like to open the floor for question and comment from all the students, please. If you have a questions, please identify your name. Raise your hand first, of course, and identify your name and address the question to the panel, to the people in the panel or the whole panel, please. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ngân. I am a senior student at Diplomatic Academy Vietnam. And first of all, I would like to thank the Diplomatic Academy Vietnam and also the Canadian Embassy for organizing such a very informative lecture on this matter. And I have two questions for you. First of all, I can see that the Canada IPS emphasizes the support for central role of ASEAN, and also it stresses on the increasing engagement in other multilateral mechanisms, which is not ASEAN-centered. So I would like to ask, how can Canada balance between the support for ASEAN centrality and the support for other mechanisms so that it can ensure the ASEAN centrality? And the second question is, I recognize that Canada has increased its military presence in the region through joint drills with the US, the Australia on the South China Sea, or through the transits through Taiwan Strait. Do you think that this action can like aggravate the tensions in this hotspot? And how do you manage the situation so that so as not to worsen the situation? Thank you.
Is there anyone in the panel that you would like to address the question to? Or you would like to open it for the whole panel?
Yeah, I open it for.
All right, thank you.
Let me start with the second question. Ngang, thank you very much for the question. So I think that and again, I'm speaking as a scholar, not as the government person, so I want to emphasize that Canada is, of course, geographically a big country, but we have limited resources, so we need to use our resources smartly. Smartly means maybe we don't send frigates to the region, maybe we send personnel to be plugged into existing cooperation. And I think this is a smart way to provide some security partnerships to the region. And I think this is a creative way to add value by providing capacity or capabilities, not capacity. Now, your question revolves around, will it aggravate tensions, in particular talking about with China? I think that it's really important that Canada works within different formulas. Let's say it works with South Korea, Japan, and Australia in the South China Sea, or in transits across the Taiwan Straits, or supporting the South China Sea. We need to have different formulas that demonstrate that the challenges in the region are not just about China and the United States, but are important for middle powers, because middle powers, and Vietnam is a middle power, believe it or not, without rules and without us, without rules being the arbiter of how we engage in international affairs, middle powers and small powers will be at the mercy of great powers. And I can't tell you how important this is that middle powers need to be out there on the front cooperating with each other to demonstrate that we value the current rules-based order, and our prosperity and stability is very much linked to that. So I think that it's not about aggravation, it's about sending a message of how important this system is for middle-sized and small-sized countries. And we need to make sure that we're not just working with the United States, for example, but in many formulas. And I think that's going to continue to be important. On your second question about maybe the contradiction of highlighting the centrality of ASEAN, but also working within multilateral forums, I don't think this is contradictory, I think it's complementary. And why I say it's complementary is that ASEAN has existed for 45 or 60 years in a particular way of making decisions. And that we need to recognize that and respect that and find ways to work with that and synergize our interests with that. But at the same time, we need to find other mechanisms and partnerships, and that's other multilateral relationships, to deal with other challenges. So I see this as a layered process rather than something that contradicts. It can be mutually reinforcing, but I would encourage our government to be as communicative and consultative and collaborative as possible to ensure that these layers don't contradict, but rather complement each other.
Thanks very much for the great questions. Maybe just to add on to that a little bit, I kind of see those questions coming together when you talk about the potential of our military presence in the region, whether or not that's aggravating or not. But I think we need to look at it, step back and look at it a little more broadly than that, because our defense engagement in the region is not just limited to having that physical presence of ships coming through, but it is a greater package, and Stephen touched on this as well in terms of contributing to training and capacity building. But this all fits within the context of ASEAN centrality. And so this points to the first question. It's not a choice. It's not do we invest in ASEAN or do we invest somewhere else? But it really is, we can really actually do all of these things together. And respect for the rules-based international order, respect for UNCLOS, this is all embedded within ASEAN. And so part of our investments and our engagement in the security sector, whether it is through the ASEAN Regional Forum, whether it is through having ships come through the region, whether it is through then facilitating discussions around women, peace and security, this is all in that context of ASEAN centrality.
Why not? I'll add a little bit. I think my colleagues have really summed it up well, but maybe to give an example, our Operation Neon sails to enforce UN sanctions against North Korea for its detonation of a bomb. Shortest place from A to B is through the Taiwan Strait. So sailing through the Taiwan Strait to fulfill our mandate in enforcing a UN sanction program has, you could say, aggravates tensions. I would say it creates displeasure from a certain country, and that displeasure is expressed. But at the same and we know that increased, traffic in the area could lead to incidents that are unintended, and that could have an impact. Which is why that Canada really supports the negotiations, the ASEAN negotiations towards a code of conduct. But we've also stipulated in supporting those negotiations and the importance of a code of conduct that the rights of third parties must be taken into account. So we're supporting ASEAN centrality in conducting those negotiations while noting that these are international waters that need to be maintained as international waters.
Thank you for the answer of the panelists. Any other question, please? Yeah, please, the girls on the right. Can we have the mic?
Good afternoon, honorable panel. I am Ling, a sophomore Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. So I'm very thankful about the lecture that Mr. Stephen has delivered. And I can see that, in the Indo-Pacific strategy of Canada, it's been over 2 pages to write about China.
Can you speak closer to the mic, please?
Okay. I can see that in the strategy that it has over 2 pages about China. Yes, and I can see that Canada is following a balancing act between pursuing dialogue with China to advance national interests and also agree with China action which go against international rule in terms of security. So my question here is that it's like a balancing act, or it can lean forward one-sided approach like a cooperation or disagreement. And we, Canada, support and follow the U.S. increasingly strong approach in its relation with China. Thank you.
So I think it's really critical for us to look at Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy from Canadian interests. I mentioned it's a middle power, and what I mean by middle power, its economy is about 1/10 of the size of the United States. Our diplomatic footprint is probably a 1/10 as big, and we need to be realistic about what kind of engagement we can engage with this region. It is not feasible to have a confrontational relationship with China. One, it's not something we want to do. Two, it's not something that is productive. And three, we need to be conscious that we need to find ways to, well, I call them crosswalks, and Hanoi has no crosswalks in my experience. But we need to have crosswalks to work with China on important issues of global consequence and regional consequence. And in my reading of the strategy and in my engagement as an academic, I think that we continue to try and build crosswalks with China out of necessity, but also I think we recognize the importance. Climate change we cannot solve without China. I think that if we had a more productive partnership in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, the story might have been different. I think when we're thinking about regional conflicts and dealing with developmental issues, China will be a core partner. And if you read through our strategy, although there's elements where we have differences, and I think they are very significant, we also are keeping the crosswalks open for cooperation. I think we should not just look at Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, or frankly, the French Indo-Pacific strategy, German Indo-Pacific strategy, Dutch Indo-Pacific strategy, or the EU Indo-Pacific strategy as China-centered. They all converge on this idea of a rules-based order is the preferred order for peace and stability and development. They all talk about continued trade and finding opportunities to cooperate. And the concern about sea lines of communication and, for example, the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision against China being ignored. These Indo-Pacific strategies are not anti-China. They are pro-rules-based order. And especially middle powers like Canada, we must focus on dialogue, cooperation, and building strong partnerships with entities like ASEAN. That's the only way that we can help shape the rules of the region, build stability, and shape norms so that despite different political systems, that we can have a shared understanding of how to behave in the region that brings stability. So again, I think it's important for us to distinguish from what's similar about the United States, but also what's different. And the United States have completely different capabilities, meaning they have a different approach to how they engage in the region compared to Canada.
I'd just highlight too, if you look at the strategy, there's also an emphasis on Canada improving its understanding of China, needing to understand where China's going, how decisions are made, so that we can better engage and better prepare our own citizens for a future where inevitably China is going to play a larger and larger role. That's an area where we can probably enhance our cooperation with Vietnam as well, given your relationship with China.
Other question, please? Yeah, please. If you're sitting in the front, just turn on the mic, please.
Hi. Okay. So, good afternoon, all the guests and attendants in this room today. My name is Mai, and I'm the freshman majoring in economics. So, I witnessed in your Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy saying that this will demand the main obligation and aims in environment, security, economics, and other environment ensure. So I have my first question is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, how could you limit the number of refugees and immigrants entering your countries by sea border to control the disease spread and also ensure the security of your own citizens? And my second question is that when the lockdown was implemented, how did you support them if you reject to allow them into your country? Thank you.
I can try to answer. That's a really good and specific but fascinating question. So you're right. I think all of our countries struggled with how to manage borders during the pandemic. In Canada, we had various ways of restricting flow of people in and out of the country to ensure limiting exposure to the disease, particularly at the early parts of the outbreak. Canada had, as you mentioned, refugees. Canada also has a very open system of accepting refugees and people in need. So we had to look at what kind of exceptions might be made to that policy of restricting, and then how to manage the entry of those exceptional visitors or refugees, immigrants, into the country at that time. And there was a task force set up to deal with precisely these issues, and a process of exceptions where individuals who were admitted into the country on an exceptional basis were given a letter to show at the border that they had received this permission. What would happen if somebody showed up at the border without permission or a visa? Yeah, some people were turned away, but for the most part, I think that system of ensuring people who really needed to get in and had the authorization to get in worked. It was an enormous amount of work, but we made it work.
Perhaps just to add to that, I just have a small example of how one of the programs that we support through with ASEAN, our SEED program, which we mentioned at the outset, how we reacted during the pandemic, which, as you know, included a lot of travel restrictions, and as I'm sure you're very, very familiar, many institutions were fully online. We were trying to navigate how to continue to operate such a program, recognizing, of course, the importance of education. I think that was a critical lesson for us all during the pandemic. But one of the small things that we did, but we thought was really quite valuable, we had students who were in Canada who had participated, who were participating in the SEED program, and because of how the sort of rolling restrictions were happening around the world, at one point in time, we did have some students who were not able to return to their country. So we adapted the SEED program that we had in place to make sure that we could continue to support those individuals, ensure that they had somewhere to stay and had their their daily subsistence attended to. And that's just an example of how we ensured that we pivoted the programming that we have in place to make sure that we could adjust to the realities of the pandemic. So it's just a piece of that, just to illustrate how we responded during that time. Thank you.
Thank you. So with the permission of the ambassador, I will expand our section until 2:10. So we have time for several more questions. So the girl over here, and I saw a hand back here. So please hand out the mic to the back for us, and you please.
Thank you, Dr. Lan Anh. So distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, and all my fellow students at DAV, very good morning, very good afternoon to everyone in the room. So my name is Tâm Hiền, and I'm from the Faculty of Politics. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the insightful speeches and lecture you have given to us. And I have several questions. First of all, about the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy. So I want to ask about the timing of releasing the strategy. Is that a bit late or just on time, and how it represents Canadian core values? And the second question, actually, Dr. Stephen Nagy have mentioned many times that Canada is a superpower, a middle power. And in fact, initially I tended to ask you your point of view about ASEAN countries like Vietnam to become a middle power, but you said that Vietnam is a middle power already. So my question is, in Canadian plan, do you have any initiative to create formulas where middle power can work together in the region? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very two interesting questions. I would like to take the question from the student on the back, so the panel can answer all together.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, the panel, for a very insightful and informative presentation. It really helps us understand more about the current foreign affairs of foreign policy of Canada. And I would like to add a question about the transferring process of one economy to a green and more green and sustainable one. So I think that transferring the traditional fossil fuel-based economy into a green and sustainable one would be a long and challenging and costly process, which requires, I think, lots of collective efforts and resources. So I think that this process may sometimes hurdle the development rate of one's economy, which is not so good for developing countries like Vietnam, I think. So I would like to ask about the what specific actions and initiatives would Canada would take to accompany and support Vietnam and other developing countries to solve this predicament. Thank you.
Back to the panel, please.
I would say we released the Indo-Pacific strategy right on time, but I think Dr. Nagy might have a different perspective, so I'll ask him to
let's in terms of timing, I think we've been expecting an Indo-Pacific strategy for quite a while. In my world, in the scholarly world, we were wondering why it came late. And frankly, I think it had to do with a lot of different aspects of global politics. I think and again, I'm not speaking as a diplomat because I'm not a diplomat, but I think from an analytical point of view, the former administration in the United States was frankly required all our diplomatic resources to try and manage it. And it created, my view is that it distracted us from moving forward on the Indo-Pacific. The COVID-19 pandemic as well created challenges. And the reality is that we had two Canadians that were, I think, arrested arbitrarily by the Chinese government, which created a real challenge. How do we create an Indo-Pacific strategy that's not anti-Chinese and will still allow for our not be interpreted as anti-Chinese? And I think that these were all kind of converging interests that created a delay in the process. Ultimately, we had an election in 2021, and if you follow the domestic debate in Canada, nothing was about the Indo-Pacific. There wasn't even much about China. And this speaks to, I think, the very first question about, does the Indo-Pacific strategy represent Canadian core values? And I think actually there's three areas that really represent the core values. One is reconciliation with the Native people. This is something that's at home very, very important for Canada. And you see this in the unconventional formulation of cooperation with Taiwan, working with New Zealand, working with Pacific Island countries, working with Australia to deal with these issues in that region. So here I see a link between the domestic reconciliation and how we are formed a pillar. On the environment, Canada is very much moving towards a green economy, and we can't do it at home and not promote it abroad. And I think this is when you look at some of the pillars, and I didn't mention a lot of the details today, but there's a lot of focus on clean energy, Canada being a clean energy provider, Canada using some of its technologies to provide and add value to this region's development. So here again, I see a direct link between the domestic debate on the environment and some of the main pillars. Three is diversity and inclusion policies. Over the past 10 years, I'm actually really proud to see our cabinet, the people that run our country, look like our country. There's men, there's women, there's people that are all different colors, all different sexualities. I'm very proud of this. I think it really represents all Canadians, and I think this is really critical, and this is why one of the pillars is key in the Indo-Pacific strategy, promoting diversity and inclusion and inclusive development through a feminist foreign policy. So I think there's a deep connection between these. This just tries to bridge this delay with the really core values that I think are represented in this policy. And they are broadly shared in the Canadian context. And I mentioned in a panel this morning, will it change if we have a leadership change? I don't think so, because these values are broadly accepted in Canadian society. On on the middle powers issues, how many of you read the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index? Put up your hand. Great, a couple of you. So I really recommend you take a look at it. It's called the Asia Power Index by the Lowy Institute in Australia. And it gives a comprehensive ranking of countries. The United States is at the top, China's second. And it uses economic power, military power, diplomatic power, economic networks, a whole bunch of different barometers. And you see there's a huge gap. All right? There's a huge gap between the top tier countries and the small countries. And that middle group contains countries like Australia, Japan, South Korea. Canada's not in it. I hope next year they'll be in it. I'm going to lobby them next week when I visit Australia. But in terms of comprehensive power, Canada is a middle power. Absolutely, in terms of economic size, diplomatic resources. Vietnam is similar. Now, your question, is Canada trying to create middle power coalitions? I would say yes, but it should do more. It should do a lot more. Back in 2018, after the North Koreans detonated a nuclear bomb, Canada convened many middle powers and the United States to come and talk about denuclearization. We should do more. We stopped. It was a one-shot deal. We should have kept doing it. After our Canadians were arrested, we put together a coalition of countries against arbitrary detention. I thought it was great, and we brought a lot of middle powers. We should do more, and we should keep doing that. And we need to advocate for the Japanese and the Australians and the Vietnamese that have been arrested in the same way. So these kinds of coalitions can be ad hoc and on different issues. And I think that Canada can do this and have a unique brand in the region that sits aside from the United States. And I personally think Canada should continue to deepen the relationship with the United States, but also have a Canadian brand, right? So if it's promoting diversity and inclusion, perfect. If it's about middle power diplomacy to prevent economic coercion, that's great, right? If it's about environmental issues, that's great. But we need consistency and sustainability and to continue to invest in those coalitions. And I think Vietnam is a really interesting partner to be thinking about how they can deal with some of the developmental challenges in ASEAN. And maybe the partnership is Vietnam, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Canada. That could be the formula to help deal with these issues. Or if we're thinking about infrastructure connectivity initiatives, why not build a formula where Canada works on the good governance, Japan provides the funding and financing, Australia maybe the natural resources. It's all this creative diplomacy that can work where we build different middle power formulas to deal with challenges. But consistency is really, really important. The last question about the environment is really interesting. And I think we need to step away from state top-down driven processes to deal with environmental issues and environmental transition. And we may want to start thinking about unique ways to engage. So education is one. So garbage separation. Do you separate your garbage in Vietnam? No, right? So this is something simple. And I think that being more aware of the different habits of lifestyle that can contribute to better environment or green transition is important. We can also look at alternative initiatives, and here again I think Canada can work with countries like Japan on city-to-city forms of cooperation. So you might be interested in this. There's something called the Kyushu Initiative out of Japan. And Kyushu used to be one of the dirtiest cities in Japan. Today it's one of the cleanest cities in Japan. And they started initially working with Dalian in China to deal with air pollution issues. And they expanded their city-to-city cooperation to include Bangkok, Manila, Cebu, Hanoi, Da Nang. So it's a city-to-city diplomacy that deals with really little stuff, but it's the little stuff that causes big change, right? Read the book Atomic Habits. It's a great book, okay? But it's a collection of little changes that can bring cheap but big changes. So I think those kinds of creative initiatives, Canada could be part of, either through a middle power kind of formulation or otherwise, where we work on training, we work on awareness. We do the little changes that collectively have big changes. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's a perfect answer. I would just add that for Vietnam in particular, yeah, climate change transition, clean energy transition takes a long time. Vietnam has recently signed a political declaration joining the Just Energy Transition Partnership with a commitment of up to $15 billion in spending to support that transition. And when we say in the G7, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, it acknowledges it's not just technology. The just part of it means that you have to retrain workers who may have been working in a coal mine or in a coal power plant. It has to be just. So some of that funding of $15 billion could go to social programs, retraining programs. But you're right, it takes a long time to do that, and it's the earlier you start, the better. So we're grateful that Vietnam has made that commitment.
Yeah, we're okay for the final round of questions. So if anyone have question, you can raise. This is your last chance.
Can I ask the question, as you students, what do you expect of Canada and its Indo-Pacific engagement? What would make a difference for you? Is it scholarships? Is it training? Is it having more diplomats, having these kinds of sessions? What would be meaningful for you as young Vietnamese, young Southeast Asians?
Any one of you would like to answer the question? Yeah, I saw the hand on the back. Give her the mic, please.
I think we hope that Canada will kind of have more scholarship for Southeast Asia students, yeah, all the way. And from my point of view, I also hope that Canada will kind of more work closely with Vietnam and other ASEAN country in the green transition. Yes, because I think this green transition will need more and more resources, more money, and I think Canada will be a very helpful partner in this process. Thank you.
So education and transition to clean energies is the two on the list. Any other idea? Any add-on on that list? Everyone agree? Anyone have the different opinions, or just add on some burning idea that we can seeking the assistance from Canada on the IPS?
Do you think knowing more about Canada and what Canada can offer to Vietnam and Southeast Asia, would that be helpful? Do you feel like, are you feeling, I don't really know about Canada, so I don't know what they can offer? Like, that might be, so knowing more about some of what Canada can bring to the region, would that be helpful? Yeah? It's an interesting question because when I go through the region, I hear similar views. We don't really know where Canada sits, what can they offer. So I think this is an important, that's what the diplomats need to do is, again, talk more about what Canada can offer to the region, whether it's education or environmental policies or legal training or, again, helping with building strong institutions. These are all interesting ways, or the digital economy. How can we help with the digital economy or cybersecurity? More finding out what Canada can bring to the region will be critical to helping you answer that question.
Well, maybe it is the assumption from the other Southeast Asian country, but not for Vietnam, and especially not for DAV. You know that Vietnam is, Canada is on the top 5 destination of Vietnamese students going abroad. And the DAV student is very much exposed, so I'm not surprised if they feel like Canada is not far away. Well, all right.
My leg is not good, so can I sit down? Okay. So actually, this is not opinions on your question. I just have some critical or opposing point that I want to put here. So firstly, I heard in your Canada Indo-Pacific strategy that you care about people who live along the Mekong Delta, and you said that their lives might be like negatively affected by climate change. So my first question is why the consequences of natural disasters of people living there is at the center of the interest, when the norm is that developed countries will suffer less from climate change. So why the consequences in somewhere else matter to you? That is the first question. Secondly, do you think that it is the responsibility of developed countries for solving climate change problem? And when it comes to green energy transition, there is a very heated debate about whether it actually create more pressures in developing countries. Because as developing countries, we do not have that much resources or technology. So it actually turned the emphasis and the responsibilities on developing countries. And so therefore, countries should just keep pushing and pulling responsibilities, and we developing countries have the burden of transitioning our infrastructure, our technology. But how can we do that? Because we need development. And to develop, we must keep it with what we have right now. So what is Canada's stance on that, and how can you solve that heated debate? Thank you.
I can see that the conversation got heated.
Literally.
So I think it's really, really interesting to think about why Canada should care about what happens to the Mekong Delta or other places. And I think it has to do with the spillover effect. And this region is the economic center of global growth. By 2040, again, I think, I can't even remember the figures, but I wish I had that paycheck. It's huge. And what happens in this region matters. If there's conflict, if sea lines of communication are disrupted, if the climate changes and it causes food insecurity or human security issues, this will disrupt the region's economy, the region's stability, and the region's prosperity. And this will spill over not only to the region, but globally. So I think it's somewhat preventative that we need to be very much proactive in thinking about these areas. Now, I mentioned the Mekong Delta because we're sitting in ASEAN, okay? I could have mentioned South Asia and climate change in terms of Bangladesh. In my lifetime, Bangladesh will be underwater. And there'll likely be millions of refugees disrupting the region. Do we have an interest in preventing that from happening? Absolutely, because it will spiral into conflict. It'll spiral into human tragedy. So it's from that standpoint that I think we need to be engaged, and we need to be proactive, and we need to plan for, I think, an inevitable future. All right? Besides these human tragedies, it's pretty clear that transnational diseases are moving up the ecosystem. They used to be trapped within the tropics, and now they're moving up into the temperate zones. Whether it's Zika in North and South America, whether it's COVID, arguably these might not have happened if the climate change wasn't there. So I think that we have a vested interest. Now that leads to your second question. Who is responsible for dealing with climate change and dealing with these issues? Obviously, it's a mix. I think if we just give money, this is not going to deal with some of the institutional challenges, the corruption issues that also contribute to the environmental challenges and the problems within the region. So I think the top down, probably we need to provide technology from the developed states, probably some kind of financing, grants, maybe training, education to deal with these issues. But we also need to see efforts at the bottom side, and I don't mean bottom in terms of like in a negative way. We need to see movements towards more transparency, less corruption, more rules-based institutions. So any kind of aid that we provide has sustained, meaningful, and it's locked in at the institutional level, so it lasts. So I see it from the top and the bottom, rather than just rich countries giving a lot of money. I have teenage boys. If I just give them money, it doesn't solve the problems, right? They got to change their behavior too, so we have a harmonious family. And I mean, it's a simple example, but it's true, right? We need to provide the aid, but we also need changes from the bottom up to develop a more sustained approach to environmental issues and disaster issues, as I mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in the case of Vietnam, enormous challenges for that transition. If you look at the partnership with the G7 and others in the Just Energy Transition Partnership, it's a subject of a negotiation. On one side, partners who are providing the money demanding that Vietnam be very ambitious. And Vietnam on the other side explaining, wow, if you want us to be that ambitious, that's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to be very painful. So you're going to have to pay more. I mean, that's how the negotiations kind of came to the result that they did, where Vietnam's government agreed to aim for certain targets, and the G7 and its partners agreed to find up to $15 billion in financing. You could have seen an agreement very different from that, but that's kind of the negotiation where we ended up with. And the whole broader issue of, that was negotiated at the last COP meetings, the responsibility of the developing countries to pay for climate mitigation and adaptation. That's a real debate. I think there was good progress made in the last negotiations, but as Professor Nagy says, it's got to be a give and take. Thanks.
Just very quickly, just on the ASEAN perspective about whose responsibility is it? I think it's also about how we invest as well. So in terms of how we work with ASEAN, we see this as a partnership. So that it is not just Canada saying this is the way something should be done, here is the assistance, but recognizing what is the ASEAN plan in place, what is the community vision in these areas, and making sure that we're working through those channels, because that's going to increase the likelihood of sustainability, whether it is on something like climate change or anything else that is going to support the growth of the region.
Well, such a great time together, almost 90 minutes, and we have a very comprehensive understanding about Canada's IPS, as well as a very interesting and frank discussion with the distinguished top Canadian diplomat as well as scholars. So could you please join me to thank the panel by a big applause? I also would like to thank you guys, students, for participating in the lectures today and give very interesting questions. I hope to see you next time in the next lectures. Thank you so much.